Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you heartfelt tales of resilience, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. Today's story takes us into the life of Emily, a woman trapped in a world of control and pain, who must find the courage to reclaim her freedom. It's a journey of self-discovery, friendship, and the profound power of hope. Join us as we unravel this inspiring tale and explore the lessons we can all learn from her fight for a better life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's story. The wedding was everything one would expect from a grand event hosted by the elite in Newport, Rhode Island. The venue, a sprawling mansion perched on a hill overlooking the ocean, seemed to glow in the golden light of the setting sun. White roses adorned every corner, their scent mingling with the salty breeze drifting in from the Atlantic. The guests, dressed to impress in their designer gowns and tailored suits, moved gracefully through the banquet hall, their laughter echoing under the glittering chandeliers. It was a scene of elegance and perfection. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a tension so palpable it felt like a thread pulled too tightly, ready to snap. Standing in the center of the room was the bride, Emily, a vision in her pristine white gown. The lace details on her dress caught the light with every movement, making her look ethereal. But Emily's face betrayed her. Behind the forced smiles and polite nods, her discomfort was clear to those who looked closely enough. She clutched her bouquet tightly, as though holding on to it for dear life. Beside her stood Andrew, the groom, a tall man in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that seemed to exude power. His every move was calculated, his smile practiced. But his eyes, the eyes that once held promises of love and a future filled with happiness, now carried something darker. Control. Domination. Emily had noticed the shift months ago, but she had convinced herself it was just the stress of wedding preparations. Now, as she stood there beside him, she wasn't so sure. Sarah, Emily's best friend, had noticed it too. She wasn't part of this elite world, her simple blue dress setting her apart from the glittering crowd. But Sarah had been with Emily through thick and thin, and she knew her friend better than anyone else. As Sarah approached her in the banquet hall, she leaned in close, her voice low but filled with concern. "Emily," she whispered, "are you okay? Did he do something to you?" Emily shook her head quickly, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, Sarah. Really. It's just, everything is so overwhelming." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She saw the way Emily's hand trembled as she adjusted the hem of her dress. "He changes when things don't go his way, doesn't he?" Sarah pressed, her voice filled with suspicion. Before Emily could answer, Andrew turned toward them, his gaze icy and unyielding. A bride shouldn't take her eyes off the groom on her big day. "My love," he said, his tone calm but with an edge that sent shivers down Sarah's spine. Sarah stepped back, her instincts warning her not to push Andrew further. She had never liked him, even when Emily first introduced him as the charming businessman who had swept her off her feet. Something about him had always felt off. And now, Sarah could see that Emily was caught in a web she didn't know how to escape from. The reception began, the soft strains of a string quartet filling the air as waiters circulated with glasses of champagne. Emily tried to immerse herself in the atmosphere, forcing herself to laugh at the guests' small talk and to smile for the endless photographs. But the weight of Andrew's presence beside her made it impossible to relax. His hand on her lower back, his whispers in her ear, it all felt suffocating. As if she were on display not as his partner but as his possession. It was during dinner that the evening took a turn Emily hadn't anticipated. Mr. James, an elderly guest and a family friend, leaned forward and asked a question that seemed harmless at first but quickly turned the air in the room heavy. "Emily," he began, his voice warm with the familiarity of someone who had known her since childhood. "Wasn't there a musician you used to date? A young man named David? If I remember correctly." The clink of silverware and soft murmurs of conversation fell silent. Emily felt her heart stop for a moment as she looked at Andrew out of the corner of her eye. His grip on his wine glass tightened. His jaw clenched. She turned to Mr. James with a forced smile, trying to diffuse the tension. "That was a long time ago," she said lightly. "It's all in the past now." Andrew's voice, low but sharp, cut through the air like a blade. "In the past," he repeated. "Then why is it still being mentioned?" Emily's cheeks burned as the guests around them exchanged awkward glances. "Andrew," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please. This isn't the time or place." Andrew set his glass down on the table with a resounding clink, cutting her off. "Perhaps you've forgotten," he said, his voice rising, "that you are my wife now. Emily. I do not tolerate betrayal. Not even in thought." Gasps rippled through the hall as Emily took a step back, her heart racing. She felt as though she were shrinking under his gaze, the weight of his accusations pressing down on her like a physical force. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to plead with him to stop. But the words caught in her throat. Sarah, standing nearby, couldn't remain silent any longer. "Andrew," she said firmly, stepping forward. "This isn't the right place for an argument. Let Emily calm down." Andrew turned on her with a look of pure disdain. "You have no right to interfere in our affairs," he snapped. "You should learn to stay quiet." Emily looked at Sarah, her eyes pleading. But before Sarah could say more, Andrew's hand shot out. The sound of the slap echoed through the hall like a gunshot, silencing every conversation, every whispered murmur. Emily staggered back, her hand flying to her cheek as tears spilled down her face. The pain of the blow was sharp, but the humiliation was worse. She felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on her, their shock and pity burning into her skin. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, some guests began to leave, unable to stomach the violent display. Others stood frozen, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. Andrew remained where he was, his face cold, showing no remorse. "This is how you need to learn your place, Emily," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Emily couldn't respond. Her body trembled, her vision blurred by tears. She felt utterly alone, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to celebrate her happiness. Margaret, Andrew's mother, approached, her expression one of disdain rather than concern. "A woman must know her duties," Margaret said coldly, her words cutting through Emily's soul like a knife. It was Sarah who finally stepped forward, her arms wrapping around Emily as she tried to pull her away from the crowd. But Emily seemed too weak to move, her legs trembling beneath her. She could hear the whispers of the guests, their voices like distant echoes in her mind. She felt like a broken doll, her strings cut, unable to stand or speak or resist. The sparkling lights of the chandeliers above seemed to mock her, their brilliance a cruel contrast to the darkness that had settled over her heart. All she wanted was to escape, to disappear from this nightmare, but she didn't know how. And as she looked at Andrew, standing tall and emotionless in the center of the room, she realized that this wasn't just a wedding. It was the beginning of a prison she had unknowingly walked into. The once bustling banquet hall had grown quieter, though the tension in the air hung thick like a storm cloud that refused to break. Emily sat slumped on a long, velvet-upholstered sofa tucked into a secluded corner of the room, her hands clutching the edge of her wedding dress. Her face was flushed and streaked with tears, her cheek still stinging from the slap, and her chest felt heavy, as though her ribs were being squeezed. She could feel the gazes of the remaining guests occasionally darting toward her. Their curiosity stung just as much as Andrew's hand had. Sarah was by her side, crouched low to meet her at eye level. She reached for Emily's hand and gave it a firm squeeze. "Emily," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Listen to me. You can't let this continue. You have to leave. Right now." Emily shook her head weakly, her eyes refusing to meet Sarah's. "I can't. Sarah," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. My family, they've sacrificed so much for this wedding. Everything is tied to this marriage, their reputation, their business. If I leave, I'll bring shame to all of them. Sarah's grip on Emily's hand tightened. Shame? Emily, do you hear yourself? What's truly shameful is what Andrew just did to you in front of everyone. And this isn't the first time, is it? Her voice softened as she saw Emily wince. You're more than just a daughter or a wife. You're a person. Emily, your family loves you, they'd never want this for you. Emily's lips quivered as she tried to hold back another wave of tears. She wanted to believe Sarah. But the weight of expectations and family loyalty had always been a chain around her neck. She had convinced herself for months that she could make this work. That Andrew's temper could be managed. That if she just stayed quiet, everything would smooth over. But tonight had shattered that illusion. Before Emily could reply, Andrew reappeared. His footsteps were deliberate. His posture as composed as ever. But his cold gaze was sharper than a knife. Sarah straightened immediately, standing between Andrew and Emily, her protective instinct kicking in. What do you think you're doing, Sarah? Andrew asked, his voice calm but laced with venom. This is a family matter. You don't belong here. Family matter? Sarah shot back, her voice unflinching. You humiliated her in front of 100 people. You hit her. That's not a family matter, that's abuse. Andrew's jaw tightened, and he took a deliberate step closer to Sarah. This is the last time I'll warn you. Sarah, stay out of it. If you care about Emily, you won't make this worse for her. Sarah didn't move, but Emily reached out and tugged on her hand, her voice barely audible. Please. Sarah, she whispered, her tone desperate. Just don't. Sarah turned to her, her face etched with anguish. Emily, you can't keep doing this, letting him. Enough. Andrew snapped, his voice rising slightly. His icy composure cracked for a moment, and the threat in his tone made even Sarah hesitate. He turned to Emily, leaning down so only she could hear. Come with me, he said, his voice low but commanding. Now. Emily stood slowly, her knees trembling beneath the weight of the moment. She didn't look at Sarah, knowing her friend's eyes would be filled with disappointment and pain. Instead, she followed Andrew as he led her away, feeling like a puppet being dragged by invisible strings. The hall fell silent as they crossed the room. The whispers had faded into nothing more than wary glances, the guests too afraid or indifferent to intervene. Emily's movements felt robotic as Andrew guided her back to the center of the party. Once they were among the guests again, he handed her a glass of wine and leaned in close, his voice soft but laced with warning. Smile, he whispered in her ear, his hand gripping her waist with calculated firmness. You wouldn't want to embarrass me again, would you? Emily forced a weak, trembling smile, though the effort made her feel like she might shatter. The guests began to resume their conversations, as though pretending everything was fine would make it so. But nothing was fine. The music, the chatter, the sparkling chandeliers, everything felt hollow, mocking. Emily felt like a stranger in her own life, trapped in a role she hadn't chosen. Across the hall, Sarah remained rooted in place, her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. She watched as Emily stood by Andrew's side, her head slightly bowed, her smile a mask of anguish. Sarah's heart burned with helpless rage. She wanted to storm across the room, to pull Emily away, to scream at Andrew and everyone else who allowed this charade to continue. But Emily's quiet plea echoed in her mind, holding her back. Nearby, Michael, a young waiter who had witnessed the slap earlier, watched the scene unfold with quiet dismay. His tray of wine glasses wavered in his hands as he struggled to keep his expression neutral. He wasn't part of this world, he was just a staff member, invisible to the wealthy guests around him, but the injustice of it all gnawed at him. As Michael stepped toward the kitchen, he hesitated, his gaze lingering on Emily. Her pain was etched into every line of her posture, every tremble of her hands. He glanced at Sarah, who was glaring at Andrew from across the room, and made a decision. Carefully placing his tray on the counter, he approached Sarah. Keeping his voice low, "Miss," he said, his tone cautious but sincere. "I saw what happened earlier. If there's anything I can do to help." Sarah looked at him, startled, but quickly saw the earnestness in his eyes. She sighed, her voice heavy with frustration. "I wish there was something I could do," she said. "But she's not ready to leave. She's too scared." Michael glanced toward Emily again, his jaw tightening. "Sometimes people need a way out," he said quietly. "I know this place inside and out. If you think she's ready, I can show you a way to leave without anyone noticing." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, her mind racing. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "But I don't think she's there yet." She looked back at Emily, her heart breaking all over again. "Not yet." Michael nodded solemnly, his eyes flicking back to Emily. "Well, if the time comes, let me know. No one deserves to be trapped like that." Sarah watched him walk away, her chest tightening with both gratitude and despair. She turned her gaze back to Emily, silently willing her to find the strength to break free. But for now, all she could do was wait and hope. The banquet hall's cold glow from the chandeliers reflected the hollowness Emily felt within. Her trembling smile persisted, a facade she wore not out of choice but necessity. The conversations buzzed around her, meaningless words floating in the suffocating air. Andrew's hand remained firmly around her waist, not as a gesture of affection, but as a display of dominance. She wanted to scream, to rip his hand away, to demand that the entire world see her pain, but she couldn't. She was paralyzed, trapped by years of expectation, obligation, and fear. From across the room, Sarah continued to watch with anguish. Every part of her wanted to march over and pull Emily away, but she could still feel the icy weight of Andrew's warning. She had seen the look in his eyes, a man who would stop at nothing to maintain control. But Sarah was not one to back down. Her mind raced as she considered her options. She couldn't force Emily to leave, but she could still plant seeds of strength. And when the moment came, she'd be ready. Meanwhile, Emily's mind was in turmoil. The world around her blurred, the music and voices reduced to a dull hum. Her thoughts spiraled back to the past, the small, insidious moments when Andrew's mask had begun to slip. At first, it had been little things, a sharp word here, a controlling comment there. Then, over time, the sharpness turned to cruelty, and the control became suffocating. But even then, she had convinced herself it wasn't so bad. She had clung to the hope that his mood swings were temporary, that she could fix things if she just tried harder. Now, standing beside him in this room full of people, she realized the truth. Andrew didn't see her as a person. To him, she was a possession, an extension of his power and status. And tonight, in front of all these people, he had proven it. As these thoughts consumed her, Andrew leaned closer, his lips brushing against her ear in a way that made her flinch. "Keep smiling," he murmured. "You're doing fine. Just don't forget your place." Emily's stomach twisted, but she obeyed, her lips trembling as they forced themselves into a weak curve. Andrew straightened, turning his attention to a group of businessmen who had approached to shake his hand. He fell easily into conversation, laughing and charming, as though nothing had happened. Emily took a small, trembling step backward, desperate to create some space between them. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, to ground her. That's when her gaze landed on Sarah, who was watching her with an expression of quiet determination. The moment their eyes met, something shifted. For the first time that evening, Emily felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months: hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was there, a tiny spark fighting against the darkness. She didn't know how or when, but a voice inside her whispered that she couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. underscore 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 underscore. Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed Emily's silent cry for help. On the other side of the room, Michael stood near the kitchen entrance. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't hear what Andrew had whispered to her. But he didn't need to. He had seen enough in her face, in her body language, to understand the depth of her pain. As a waiter, Michael was used to being invisible in rooms like this. The rich and powerful never noticed him unless he was refilling their glass or clearing their plate. But tonight, he had noticed more than he ever wanted to. He had seen how Andrew had treated Emily, how her supposed friends and family had turned a blind eye, how everyone here seemed complicit in her suffering simply by their silence. It made his blood boil. He thought back to his earlier conversation with Sarah. She had seemed reluctant to accept his offer to help Emily escape. But Michael understood why. He had seen that same look in Emily's eyes, the fear, the hesitation, the crushing weight of doubt. He knew it wasn't easy to leave, especially when someone like Andrew had spent years convincing her she couldn't. But Michael also knew that if the moment came, if Emily decided to fight for her freedom, she would need people by her side. And he was determined to be one of those people. No matter what. He caught Sarah's eye from across the room and gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah blinked in surprise but quickly understood. It wasn't much, but it was a silent promise. If Emily was ready, they would act. Underscore 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 underscore. Emily's fragile hope carried her through the next hour. But the weight of the evening began to wear her down again. She stood by Andrew's side like a porcelain doll, her face pale and her movements mechanical. She barely registered the conversations happening around her. All she could feel was the ache in her chest, the unbearable weight of the life she had built, or rather, the life that had been built around her. When Andrew stepped away to speak with another guest, Emily seized the brief moment of freedom. She turned to Sarah, who had finally crossed the room to stand nearby. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I can't do this anymore." Sarah's eyes widened, and she immediately stepped closer. "Then don't," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You don't have to stay, Emily. You don't owe him or anyone your life." Emily shook her head, her tears threatening to spill over again. "But my family, they'll be so disappointed. They put everything into this marriage." Sarah placed both hands on Emily's shoulders, forcing her to meet her gaze. "Emily, listen to me. Your family loves you. But their approval isn't worth your happiness or your safety. You deserve better than this." Emily opened her mouth to reply. But before she could, she felt a shadow fall over her. She turned to see Andrew standing behind her, his expression dark. "What are you two whispering about?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. Sarah straightened, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Nothing that concerns you, Andrew," she said, her tone ice-cold. "I'm just reminding Emily that she has a right to her own life." Andrew's eyes narrowed, and his jaw tightened. "She's my wife," he said, each word clipped. "Her life is exactly where it should be, beside me." Emily froze, her fragile hope flickering like a candle in the wind. But as Andrew's hand reached for her arm, she felt Sarah's grip tighten on her shoulder. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice steady and filled with resolve. "You don't have to go with him." The words hung in the air, a lifeline extended in the darkness. For a moment, Emily hesitated, torn between the chains of her old life and the faint glimmer of freedom. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat as Andrew's hand reached for her arm. The room seemed to hold its breath alongside her. For a split second, she saw the life she had been enduring, a cycle of fear, control, and humiliation. It stretched out before her, endless and bleak, and it made her stomach turn. But beside her stood Sarah, her best friend, her unwavering source of strength. Her words echoed in Emily's mind, "You don't have to go with him." Andrew's hand closed around her wrist, his grip firm, possessive. "Let's go, Emily," he said, his voice a low growl that only she and Sarah could hear. To anyone else in the room, it might have sounded like a husband gently guiding his wife. But Emily knew better. His tone was a warning, a reminder of who held the power. For a moment, Emily's instinct was to comply, to obey. She had done it so many times before. It was easier to go along with what he wanted, to avoid the storm that followed resistance. But as she looked up into Andrew's cold, unrelenting gaze, something inside her shifted. She wasn't sure if it was Sarah's presence or the growing weight of everything she had endured. But suddenly, she couldn't bear the thought of another day, another moment, spent living under his thumb. "No," she whispered. Her voice was quiet, shaky, but it was enough to make Andrew's eyes narrow. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone dangerously calm. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in her chest. She pulled her wrist from his grasp, taking a small step back. "I said no," she repeated, louder this time. The word tasted foreign on her tongue, but it also felt like a release, a first step toward reclaiming her voice. The space between them felt electric, charged with tension. Andrew's face darkened, his jaw tightening as his hands curled into fists at his sides. "You're making a scene," he hissed. "Don't forget where you are, Emily. Don't embarrass me." But Emily's resolve only grew stronger. She glanced around the room, seeing the faces of the guests, some curious, others pretending not to notice the unfolding drama. She saw Michael standing near the edge of the room, his face full of quiet concern. And she saw Sarah beside her, her expression one of fierce encouragement. For the first time, Emily realized that she wasn't entirely alone. "You're the one embarrassing yourself, Andrew," Sarah said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, sharp, cutting through the suffocating tension, dragging her around like she's your property. "You should be ashamed." Andrew turned his glare on Sarah, but she didn't flinch. If anything, she looked ready to fight, her body brimming with protective energy. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This is between me and my wife." "No, it's not," Sarah shot back. "You lost the right to call it a private matter the moment you raised your hand against her in front of everyone here. Everyone saw what you did. Andrew, you can't hide it, no matter how much you pretend." Emily felt her heart race as she watched the confrontation unfold. Sarah's words struck something deep within her, and for the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of courage. Andrew's hold over her wasn't unshakable. His power wasn't absolute. She had a choice. "Andrew," she said, her voice cutting through the argument. Both Andrew and Sarah turned to look at her, but Emily's focus was solely on him. "This isn't working. I can't. I won't do this anymore." Andrew's eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely stunned. Then his expression hardened into one of cold fury. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "You're my wife, Emily. You don't get to just walk away." Emily's hands trembled, but she held her ground. "I'm not walking away," she said, though she knew that wasn't entirely true. "I'm choosing myself for once. I can't keep living like this." The room had grown quieter. The soft murmur of voices and the clinking of glasses had faded as guests discreetly turned their attention to the escalating argument. Emily felt their eyes on her. But for once, she didn't care. Let them see. Let them know. She was done pretending. Andrew laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. And where will you go? He sneered. You think you can survive without me? Without this? He gestured to the grandeur of the banquet hall. The glittering chandeliers. The opulent decor. You wouldn't last a day. Emily. You have nothing. She has me. Sarah said firmly, stepping closer to Emily's side. And she has herself. That's all she needs. Michael, who had been watching from the sidelines, finally stepped forward. His voice was quiet but steady. If she wants to leave, I'll help her, he said. You can't force her to stay. Mr. Morgan. Andrew turned to Michael, his expression a mix of disbelief and rage. And who are you? He demanded. A waiter. You think you have any say in this? I think I have the right to help someone in need. Michael replied, his tone unwavering. She deserves better than this. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes. But they weren't tears of fear or despair this time. They were tears of gratitude. Of relief. For the first time, she realized she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Andrew's face twisted with anger. But before he could say another word, Emily stepped forward. This is over. Andrew, she said, her voice steady despite the quiver in her chest. You can't control me anymore. With that, she turned and walked away, her steps faltering but determined. Sarah was right beside her, and Michael followed a few steps behind, ready to intervene if Andrew tried to stop them. The guests parted as they moved through the room, their whispers growing louder. Emily felt their stares, but she kept her head high, refusing to let them see her crumble. She was done being the passive, obedient wife. She was ready to take back her life. When they reached the exit, Emily paused, taking one last look over her shoulder. Andrew stood frozen in the middle of the room, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of guilt, then she let it go. The doors opened, and Emily stepped outside, the cool night air washing over her. It felt like the first real breath she had taken in years. For the first time, she felt free. The night air wrapped around Emily like a blanket, its coolness biting at her skin. But she didn't care. The weight she had been carrying for years seemed to lift, piece by piece, with every step she took away from the banquet hall. Beside her, Sarah walked in quiet solidarity, her hand resting on Emily's arm as if to steady her, as if to remind her that she wasn't alone. Michael followed a short distance behind, his steps tentative, his presence steady. The three of them walked to Sarah's car, parked a little away from the mansion. As they neared it, Emily's legs began to falter. The adrenaline that had carried her out of the hall was now ebbing away, leaving exhaustion and a heaviness in its wake. She stopped, her breath hitching, and turned to Sarah. I don't know if I can do this, Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she fought back tears. Sarah turned to her and gripped her shoulders firmly, her face full of unwavering resolve. You already did, Emily. You walked out. That was the hardest part. But what happens now? Emily asked, her voice small, almost childlike. Where do I go? What do I do? Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but it was Michael who stepped forward. He cleared his throat hesitantly, his gaze meeting Emily's with a kind sincerity. You take one step at a time, he said softly, and you don't have to do it alone. Emily looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears again. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also comforted by his words. She didn't even know this man beyond his name and his quiet, observant presence throughout the evening. Yet, in this moment, he seemed to see her more clearly than most people ever had. Thank you, she said quietly. It wasn't much, but she meant it with every fiber of her being. Michael nodded, stepping back as Sarah opened the car door. Let's get out of here, Sarah said, her voice gentle but urgent. You don't owe anyone in that house anything. Emily. Not Andrew. Not his family. And definitely not their approval. Emily climbed into the passenger seat. sinking into the cool leather as though it were the first soft place she had been in years. Michael stood by the door for a moment, hesitating as though unsure if he should leave. "If you need anything," he said finally, "you know where to find me. Don't hesitate." Sarah gave him a grateful nod, and Emily managed a faint smile. "I won't forget," she said. With that, Sarah closed the door, and Michael stepped back, watching as the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the night. Emily leaned her head against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared out at the passing streets. The lights of the city blurred together, but her mind felt sharper than it had in years. "Where are we going?" Emily asked after a long silence. "To my place," Sarah replied. "You'll stay with me for now. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Emily nodded but said nothing. She felt a strange mixture of relief and dread swirling in her chest. Relief that she was finally free from the suffocating grip of Andrew's control, but dread at the uncertainty of what lay ahead. The life she had known, as painful as it was, had been predictable. This new chapter was a blank page, and that terrified her. When they arrived at Sarah's small apartment, the coziness of the space was a stark contrast to the cold, sprawling luxury of Andrew's mansion. The living room was warm and inviting, with mismatched furniture and shelves crammed with books and trinkets. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that instantly soothed Emily's frazzled nerves. Sarah led her to the couch and draped a soft blanket over her shoulders. "Sit," she said. "I'll make us some tea." Emily sank into the cushions, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. She felt like a lost child, unsure of what to do or say. The events of the evening replayed in her mind on an endless loop: Andrew's cold, controlling voice, Sarah's fierce defense of her, the stunned faces of the guests as she walked away. She wondered if she would wake up tomorrow and find it had all been a dream. When Sarah returned with 2 steaming mugs of chamomile tea, she sat beside Emily and handed her one. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," she said gently. "Just focus on breathing. One moment at a time." Emily nodded, cradling the mug in her hands and letting the warmth seep into her skin. She took a small sip, the floral taste soothing her frayed nerves. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to relax, even if only a little. "Do you think he'll come after me?" Emily asked after a long silence. Sarah's expression hardened. "He won't," she said firmly. "I'll make sure of it. And if he tries, we'll deal with it. You're not going back there, Emily. Not ever." Emily bit her lip, tears stinging her eyes again. "What about my family? They were so invested in the marriage. I'll be letting them down." Sarah placed a hand on Emily's knee, her grip reassuring. "Your family loves you. They'll understand eventually. And if they don't, well, that's on them. Not you. You don't owe anyone your happiness, Emily. Not even them." The words hit Emily like a jolt. She had spent so much of her life trying to please others, her family, Andrew, even his mother. The idea that her happiness was hers to claim felt foreign, almost selfish. But it also felt like a lifeline, a spark of hope. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Emily admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are," Sarah said without hesitation. "You're stronger than you think. You proved that tonight." Emily let out a shaky breath, her tears finally spilling over. But this time, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of catharsis. She leaned into Sarah, letting herself cry freely for the first time in years. Sarah held her, stroking her hair and murmuring soothing words. "You're free now, Emily," she said softly. "And this is just the beginning." Emily clung to those words like a lifeline. For the first time in a long time, she believed them. She was free. And no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, she would face it with the courage she had found tonight. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. The next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of Sarah's small apartment, warming the room with a gentle glow. Emily blinked her eyes open, momentarily disoriented as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. It wasn't until she saw the neatly stacked books on the corner shelf and felt the faint lavender scent in the air that she remembered where she was. For the first time in years, she woke up without the suffocating weight of Andrew's presence looming over her. She sat up slowly, her body sore from the tension and emotions of the night before. Her mind was a swirl of relief, guilt, and a lingering fear she couldn't quite shake. The silence in the apartment was peaceful, though part of her almost expected Andrew to burst through the door, his voice dripping with contempt as he demanded her to come home. But that wasn't going to happen. She reminded herself. Not anymore. The smell of coffee pulled her from her thoughts. She padded softly to the kitchen, where Sarah stood at the counter, pouring 2 mugs. She was dressed casually in a cozy sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. When she saw Emily, her face softened into a warm smile. "Good morning," Sarah said, handing Emily a mug. "How did you sleep?" Emily took the mug gratefully, the warmth seeping into her hands. "Better than I expected," she admitted, her voice still raspy from sleep. "But it still feels strange. Like it's not real." Sarah nodded knowingly. "It's going to feel that way for a while. You've been living in survival mode for so long that waking up without that weight on your shoulders feels unnatural. But it's real. Emily, you're free now." The words hung in the air, their truth both comforting and terrifying. Emily took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness ground her. She glanced at Sarah, who was watching her with a mixture of concern and encouragement. "What happens now?" Emily asked quietly. Sarah leaned against the counter, her expression thoughtful. "Now, we take things one step at a time. First, we need to make sure Andrew can't reach you. I've already spoken to a friend who works at a women's support center. They can help you with legal advice. Maybe even a restraining order if it comes to that." Emily's stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of taking legal action against Andrew felt like stepping into uncharted territory. For years, she had been conditioned to avoid conflict, to stay quiet and compliant. But she knew Sarah was right. She needed to protect herself. "I don't even know where to begin," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "I've never done anything like this before." Sarah reached out and placed a reassuring hand on Emily's arm. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll go together. They'll walk you through everything." Emily nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. She wasn't sure she deserved a friend like Sarah, someone who had stood by her, fought for her, and now was ready to guide her through the hardest chapter of her life. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to thank me," Sarah said with a gentle smile. "That's what friends are for." Later that day, they arrived at the Women's Support Center, a modest but welcoming building with bright walls and comfortable seating. Emily felt a pang of nervousness as they entered, her fingers clenching tightly around the strap of her bag. A friendly woman at the front desk greeted them and directed them to a private room where they met Clara, the center's manager. Clara was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calming presence. She invited them to sit, offering Emily a cup of tea before gently beginning their conversation. "Emily, I want to start by saying how brave you are," Clara said, her voice warm and encouraging. "Taking this step is never easy, but it's the first step toward reclaiming your life." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. I don't know where to start," she admitted. "That's okay," Clara said gently. "We'll start small. First, we'll help you understand your options. You can file for a restraining order to ensure Andrew can't come near you. We'll also connect you with a lawyer who can guide you through the divorce process. And if you need temporary housing or financial assistance, we can help with that too." Hearing Clara lay out the steps made everything feel slightly more manageable, though the weight of it all still felt overwhelming. "Will it be difficult?" Emily asked hesitantly. "Andrew is very powerful. His family is too." Clara nodded empathetically. Men like Andrew often rely on their power and control to intimidate others. But the law is on your side. And we're here to make sure you're protected. You're not alone in this. Emily. Those words, "you're not alone," felt like a lifeline. For so long, Emily had carried her pain in isolation, convinced that no one could or would help her. But sitting here, in this warm, supportive space, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. Over the next hour, Clara explained the steps Emily needed to take and introduced her to Beatrice, a sharp and compassionate lawyer who promised to handle the legal complexities of her situation. "Your safety is our top priority," Beatrice said firmly. "We'll make sure Andrew has no way of contacting or threatening you." After leaving the center, Emily felt a small flicker of hope. The road ahead was daunting. But for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. She had a team of people who believed in her and a friend who was willing to fight alongside her. She wasn't alone. Back at Sarah's apartment, the two of them sat on the couch, their legs curled under blankets as they sipped tea and talked about what came next. Sarah encouraged Emily to think about her dreams, things she had pushed aside during her marriage. At first, Emily struggled to answer. She had spent so long suppressing her own desires that she wasn't sure what they were anymore. But as the evening wore on, fragments of dreams began to surface. "I used to love art," Emily admitted. "I wanted to be an interior designer. But Andrew said it was silly, a waste of time." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's not silly at all. That's amazing. Emily, you can still pursue it. It's not too late." The idea felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Emily had spent years shrinking herself, bending to Andrew's will. To reclaim her passion felt like an act of rebellion, a declaration that she was her own person again. For the first time in a long time, she let herself dream. As the night deepened, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held. But for the first time, she felt ready to face it. This was her life, and she was finally taking it back. As Emily stepped out into the world, the warm sunlight touched her face, filling her with a renewed sense of hope and courage. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt in control of her own life. She had found her voice, reclaimed her strength, and surrounded herself with people who genuinely cared for her well-being. The chains that once bound her were broken, and she was ready to embrace a future of freedom and happiness. Emily's story reminds us of the power of resilience, the importance of self-worth, and the strength it takes to start over. No one deserves to live in fear or control, and help is always closer than we think. If this story inspired you, please like and subscribe to Life Stories for more tales of hope and courage. Thank you for your support. See you in our next story.